Islamists would become accustomed to everyone else bending over for them. They'd become more entitled and more demanding, and when someone finally stands up and criticizes them, or the religion, the situation would be so much worse. The solution isn't to appease and live in fear. The solution is to reform Islam. Speaking of reforming Islam, this is Majid Nawaz. Both him and Waleed are Muslims and experts on countering terrorism. Only there's some important differences that I should highlight. Majid feels that Muslims should be held to the same standards as everyone else. Waleed's position is self-evident. Majid will never try to blame terrorism on criticism of Islam. Waleed's been doing just that for a long time.
No, he hasn't. You've actually just lied. He never just blames terrorism on the criticism of Islam. He never even made that accusation that you're claiming. The accusation that Waleed is making is that do not interpret or allow or accommodate the same interpretation of ISIS. That's not. That is criticism of misinformation. Waleed is blaming. Waleed is saying do not spread misinformation. That is basically supporting the terrorists who spread the same misinformation. So you can't conflate the two, and you don't understand.
Majid is willing to tackle the major problems within Islam. Waleed wants to do nothing.
And he talks about Majid doesn't shift the blame. Well, Majid is a paid organization by the Quilliam Foundation who wants to change Islam. Okay, there's a difference here. The guy is a complete secularist. I mean, the guy doesn't want to uphold Sharia law or nothing to do with Islamic jurisprudence. He says Waleed Aly calls for no action and downplays the problem when the actual man is an activist working in a counter-terrorism program, yet he says he calls for no action. He says Majid Nawaz is willing to tackle Islamism and other problems within Islam when Waleed Aly is doing the very same thing. He's tackling against ISIS. In fact, he's even got threats given to him by ISIS. But apparently he's not tackling Islamism.
Problems exist. Majid is a reformist Muslim. Waleed is an Islamic apologist. And this is how you tell the difference between a reformer and an apologist. Now, Sam Harris and Majid Nawaz recently did a Late Line interview, which if you haven't seen, you really should. And this comes at a very important time. I think we're seeing the start of a reform. I think we're going to see more and
Watch how we're going to see how you get debunked further.
more Muslim reformers come forward, and that'll encourage others and so on. And with any luck, Islamic apologists like Waleed Aly won't be able to get away with their bullshit obfuscation and blame shifting any longer when they're up
against Irshad Manji,
against real progressive liberal Muslims who are actually fighting the problem. Because if there's hope for a less
fighting the problem, right? Yeah. What about Mehdi Hassan, who's a journalist at Al Jazeera? Why don't you quote him? Because he debunks people like Irshad.
We, as Muslims, and generally, actually, I'd say those on the left of centre in this debate, to insist that Islamists and jihadists have nothing to do with Islam. That's actually an exercise in dishonesty. Of course, they have something to do with Islam. I would argue it's equally incorrect to say that they are Islam per se, because of course I'm a Muslim and I'm not ISIS, I'm not an Islamist. And so I think the answer is somewhere in the middle, and that is that they have something to do with Islam. And the something there is that they are using certain passages in the scripture, as Sam correctly mentioned. There are passages in the scripture that they can resort to. So they have a plausible reading of scripture. The challenge, and this is more a plea that I make here on your show to my fellow Muslims in Australia, and that is that we as Muslims have a task ahead of us, a monumentous task ahead of us, and that is to begin the process of adapting, of reinterpreting our scriptures for the modern day and age. Now, I think that...
Did you hear that, you silly bugger? You've actually brought Majid Nawaz on stage to show that ISIS has actually got plausible evidence for the Quran, but that's not exactly what he's saying, right? What he's saying is we need to reinterpret the Quran, right? So it's basically he's denying that ISIS has anything to do with the Quran, right? Because there is another interpretation to those verses. So you didn't help yourself by bringing him onto the stage. In fact, he supports exactly what I'm saying here. I'm saying that is not interpreting it in the correct way. They may think it's plausible, but it's not. There's a separate interpretation. And you want to talk about reformation of the scripture, you want to talk about reformation of Islam and so forth. We don't call it reformation. Rather, we call it restoration, meaning come back to the true interpretation of the Quran as understood by the Sahaba and the companions, by the Hadith, and in context of how the scholars understand it. And that's exactly what ISIS terrorists and the Islamophobes have in common. They move away from scholarship, they interpret the Quran for face value for what it is and misinterpret it outside context, and that's exactly what we call them back to remove all of the reformations that they introduce and come to restoration of what it originally said. Please do visit below a clear article and a debate that took place between Abdullah Andalossi, and he discusses with these secularist Muslims like Majid Nawaz about should Islam need reformation or restoration, and you will see how we've clearly debunked the Islamophobes on that notion, because what they want is they want Islam completely changed, right? They want it changed. And even if you wanted to change it, right? Let's say you wanted to change the interpretation of the verses of the Quran, right? You know what? These Islamophobes will say, no, don't change that interpretation. We want to see that the Quran is a book of violence. There is no other misinterpretation or restoration or reformation. We can't. See, they bring up people like Majid Nawaz to speak and say Islam needs to change, but this hypocrite, this Islamophobe, will probably be against Majid Nawaz for trying to give a different interpretation, like a peaceful interpretation to the verse, because the Islamophobe always wants one interpretation, and that is that the Quran has to be only about hatred and killing and bloodshed, and there is no other interpretation, such as it being in the context of war and so forth. No, we need to accept it outside of the context of war, and this is the only correct interpretation. So the Islamophobe wants a get-out card to use Majid Nawaz as some reformer, but at the end of the day, if Majid Nawaz gave an interpretation, a peaceful interpretation, the very same Islamophobe will fight against Majid Nawaz and say, no, there is no such thing as another interpretation. So these guys are just hypocrites, double standard, inconsistent morons, really. Thank you.